Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to this session this afternoon as a part of the Resilience for Urban Forum 2021. This session is being jointly organized in partnership with United Nations Capital Development Fund and is going to focus on financing for resilience of the urban poor. My name is Orko Sinaroy and I work for the Asian Development Bank and very happy to moderate today's discussion. Before we dive into the technical discussion, let me just remind a couple of housekeeping rules. On the right-hand side of the platform, you will see the tabs on question and answer, the chat box and feedback tab. Please use the chat function to share your insights and comments. Please use the question and answer tab to post your questions. You can like other questions so that we understand which questions are in high demand, and accordingly, the panelists can try and reply to your questions. On the left side of the screen, you will see an activity feed where report cards and insights will be posted by our team. Please be advised that the session is being recorded. So once again, welcome to the discussion on financing for resilience investments for the urban poor. Since this morning, we have heard a lot about how climate and disaster risk is increasing and how cities in Asia and the Pacific region have to be prepared for a warmer world, which means we need increased investments to build resilience, and specifically investments that build resilience of the poor and vulnerable population living in urban areas. This is because they are disproportionately impacted, do not have enough adaptive capacity, and require support to help improve their lives, livelihoods, and assets and well-being. These investments need to be across sectors and themes, starting from housing, livelihood, health, social protection, and other areas. Of course, financing will play a critical role in enabling such investments, including climate adaptation financing, which has the potential to unlock other financing to help build resilience of larger urban areas. But in terms of financing, when we talk about, one is the issue about quantity of financing or volume of financing that we need to match the sheer scale of the urgency. But the other side is the quality of financing. How do we really make sure that financing is benefiting the most vulnerable and poor population? How do we make sure that the financing is secured and sustained over a longer period of term? And how do we make sure that the financing is responding to a range of needs which are changing of the urban poor population? So in this context, I'm very happy to have with us a very exciting range of panelists who come from different kind of organizations. And this is partly deliberate. We have colleagues joining us from financing organizations, but also colleagues joining us from civil society organizations, UN agencies, who sometimes receive financing and channel it, but are very critical over here in the discussion to help us understand what really works on the ground and what doesn't work. So let me introduce the panelists for us. We have with us Mr. Owen Johansen, who's a program manager at the Nordic Development Fund and has been involved in designing various resilience-related projects and programs in Asia, Central America, and Africa. We have Sophie Diakonok, who is the manager for the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility, or better known as LOCAL, under the UN Capital Development Funds. We have Mr. Mohammad Gholam Rabbani, who is the head of the Climate Bridge Fund, which is a new trust fund by BRAC and KfW, supporting climate resilience actions on the ground through NGOs in Bangladesh. We have Shobhik Ganguly, who is a senior infrastructure advisor in Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of UK and involved in various infrastructure projects on resilience building and including municipal finance and governance. And last but not the least, we have Deborah Utami, or Amy, who is from the Yakum Emergency Unit, an NGO working in Indonesia since 2001 and involved in emergency response, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. So thank you all of you for joining us today. Before we start the discussion, and this session is at interactive formats, we don't have any PowerPoint presentation, it'll be a free-flowing discussion. But let's first start with a couple of poll questions just to understand from our participants what they feel about the requirements in terms of financing. So can we please launch the first poll questions? If you see on your right-hand side of the platform, there's a tab called poll. Please click it and you will see the first question. The first question looks at building resilience of the urban poor requires additional financing. And what could be the potential sources of such financing? The options are dedicated local government budget for climate adaptation, transfers from national governments to local governments for building resilience, international climate finance, including climate adaptation finance, private sector. You can click any one option or more than one option also. Can we have the answers now? Okay, interesting. So we have a large number of participants talking about dedicated local government budgets are critical for climate adaptation. Neck to neck is transfers from national governments to local governments, and closely followed by private sector and international climate finance. So it clearly shows that perhaps all four potential sources are important and need to be accessed differently and more strategically to see how we can contribute to financing for resilience purposes for specifically for the urban poor. Let's move on to our next question, which is looking at more the quality of finance in terms of how can we ensure the financing is delivering outcomes that really benefits the poor population. We have over here three options looking at the financing should be much more longer term and programmatic financing. The financing should be patient and allow testing of new ideas and solutions and innovations. And the financing should just not focus on the delivery of outputs, but equally focus on the process in which the output is delivered. It's because this is important specifically because climate adaptation is very much a learning process. So it's important for us to focus on the process as well as the final output. So perhaps we can all try to submit our responses over here. And let's see how the responses are shaping. There is a clear need for long-term and programmatic financing from our participants, and we totally agree with it. We will hear from our panelists later on about their thinking on this topic, importance of patient and financing that allows testing of new ideas and solutions. And equally important is to look at financing that looks at processes and outputs which achieves outcomes for the resilient poor population. So thank you so much for participating in the poll. Let us now move into the discussion with our panelists. My first question to all of you will be that it is well established that we need more money at the end of the day to build resilience. Specifically, we're talking about building resilience of the poor and a vulnerable population in urban areas who don't have the resources. Now, all of you come from different types of organizations with different mandates. I would kindly request you to briefly explain through your work how you're trying to increase the scale of financing, whether it's by working with national government systems, by looking at private sector modalities, or helping countries access international climate finance, or even leveraging local other resources which may be present in your areas. So maybe I'm going to start with Amy. Do you want us to go ahead and explain to us in Indonesia, how are you helping your communities scale up access to adaptation finance?
Yeah, thank you very much, Argo, for the opportunity. So if I'm talking about Indonesia, one of the ways for us to finance and scale up the locally led climate adaptation is through assessing the village fund. So through the law number 6 in 2014 on the village, currently more than 74,000 villages have the authority to plan and set the priority agenda together with the community members in accordance with the result and recommendations that was come from the Musrembang, or the formal mechanism of local development planning. So through Musrembang, the village then will formulate the medium-term development plan for 6 years, and also the village development annual work plan every year. The village fund itself comes from the state budget, and it used for the government administrations at village level, and then development implementations, community development, as well as the community empowerment. And the amount is quite large because it can be more than 1 billion rupiah, or approximately about 700,000 USD for each village, depending on the numbers of the populations, and then area and poverty rate. Every year, the government also issues the circular letter or regulations to priority of the village fund. So, for example, in 2020, there was a reallocations of budget in which the village fund can be used for supporting the COVID-19 response in form of the direct cash assistance to the poor community. And in 2021, the government also issued the regulation again, in which it mentions that the village fund can be used for disaster response and disaster risk management, including the climate adaptations. On the other hand, villages also have included the SDGs indicators in the planning process. It means that the activities or programs that is funded by the village fund should have the correlations with the achievement of SDGs. So as climate action is one of the target one of the goals of SDGs, it can become a basis for the community when discussing the priority of actions during the development planning process. However, even though the policy and resources are available, it doesn't mean that it can be automatically used for building resilience. Yeah, if the community hasn't been informed of the planning process, what can be funded through the village fund, not to mention about the SDGs and climate change as well, only few people will raise their voices concerns, and it will leave the village to eventually file for usual activity, and majority of which is related to the infrastructures, physical infrastructures, instead of empowering the communities. So this is where the civil society organization play its roles to provide a space for sharing and also connecting the governments to be accountable to the community members, as well as to raise awareness of the urgency to address the climate change, the benefit of the climate change adaptation, as well as the correlations with the community daily life. So in the other hand, the space is also to raise the awareness from the governments that there are a lot of practices has been initiated by the community, especially the urban poor, the women group, who often left out from the decision-making process. Thank you, Argo.
Thank you, Amy, so much. Can I just clarify, you say it's village fund, but it's applicable to both rural and urban areas, is that correct?
Yes, okay. That's correct.
That's good to know. Okay, I think that's a very important example you showed us about from Indonesia, where as a part of state budgets, a pot of money is available to every urban local bodies for both administrative matters, but also community development and community empowerment purposes. But you also highlight that it's just not enough to have the money available, but how do you make sure the money can be accessed by the people who need the most, as a result of which there's a lot of preparatory work which is required to ensure the poor and vulnerable, in your case, women's group, are able to access and influence the use of money itself. And lastly, but also you talked about how you guys through your network are able to demonstrate some of the good practices that's happened in your network and how potentially it can be scaled up through government's budget as a part of the Village Fund. So that's a very exciting example. Thank you for sharing with us. Let me move to Sophie now. Sophie, as a part of the local program, of course, the key objective for you guys is to work through government systems and see how government systems can be improved and strengthened and incentivized for doing climate adaptation work at the local level. Do you want to explain a little bit about how you're trying to help scale up finance through local program?
Thank you, Arga. So indeed, the UN Capital Development Fund has been working on this kind of systems for the last 10 years. So 10 years ago, it designed what was named the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. We first worked with the government of Bhutan from 2010 onwards, and then Cambodia, to introduce and test the model. Since then, it's grown to become an internationally recognized model for channeling climate finance to communities through local government. And it can work in both urban and rural areas. There are now 27 countries implementing this kind of system, which includes 22 LDCs and about a dozen countries in Asia and the Pacific. So we see a demand growing for this kind of system and for local in particular. The way it works is, in fact, that it applies the principles of fiscal decentralization and effective local planning and public financial management to climate change. It has at its core a specific instrument that has been called performance-based climate resilience grants, which ensure through an additional window the programming and verification of climate change expenditures, and is also combined with technical and capacity building support. So essentially those grants are a financial top-up to cover the additional cost of making investment climate resilient. So they come in addition to regular development grants or finance that local governments might get. They're channeled through governmental fiscal transfer systems. So that is one key feature because it makes it scalable and a long-term solution. So it doesn't use, parallel or ad hoc structures, but rather is plugged into country systems. And that includes the flow of fund, but also, strengthening any related dimension, such as planning, budgeting, or even audits for that matter. So the national ministries working together oversee and regulate the system. And the scalability has been proven so far in Bhutan, which was the first to start and has scaled up the instrument to have the country, Cambodia, to about 25% of the country. So since it went to a global expansion, it has mobilized $125 million. Of course, it's much too small because countries as they start want to go to scale. And for that, going back to your earlier comments and poll questions, it is indeed providing long-term support. So like I mentioned, Bhutan, Cambodia, we've been working with them for about 10 years, but it's also about sequencing and federating using various forms of aid. So countries might start with project funding that is, however, used through national systems. So it's a way to make project funding possibly more plugged into national systems. We do also work with countries in their accreditation to international climate funds, such as GCF, and then in the direct access. And we see also countries putting back some of their own resources, investing their own resources in the system. So a combination of aid, sequencing of aid, so that you can achieve this long-term programmatic. As it is also not imposing certain sectors or a certain type of investment, but rather enable local governments and communities to choose every year, there is an element of testing and learning by doing through the process of planning and budgeting. Thank you, Arga.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think you highlighted a very important point about working through fiscal systems of government. In this case, of course, governments which have decentralization processes in place. You highlighted an important example of an incentive mechanism, in this case, a performance-based allocation, which is additional grant you're providing on top of existing support. And this is a good model. And third is a very critical thing about sequencing and how do you phase these different kinds of supports. So at the end of the day, of course, we want governments to be self-sustainable in the long run and be able to put their own money or mobilize their resources from private sector or other partners. But how do you sequence the startup kind of aid resources or additional financing grants in this case to help? I think we'll come back to this issue of sequencing later on. Just to move on now, maybe we'll go to Mr. Rabbani from BRAC. I mean, BRAC has newly established this Climate Bridge Fund along with KfW, which is focusing specifically on the urban areas and urban poor for climate adaptation. Maybe you can explain a little bit about how the fund works and how you're trying to leverage resources through the fund.
Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity, to be here with you to share our Climate Bridge Fund mechanism. In fact, as you know, that this fund mechanism was established in November 2019, but our journey started, the process-wise journey started from January 2020. So we are only, less than 2 years. And in fact, we have two windows under this Climate Bridge Fund, which has been established by BRAC, with support from the government of Germany through KfW. And, in the first window, that is climate change window, and the portfolio of the climate change window is, about 12 million euro. And this is an endowment fund. So it means we invest this money, about 90% of this 12 million euro has been invested in, 5 years treasury bond. And every year we get the income and we support the project from the income and the expenses of the secretariat. But in 2021, when the pandemic, has affected the entire world, including Bangladesh, the KfW also approached us, with request from BRAC to support COVID-19, 19 affected people. So they started another window, which is called emergency response window. So this window will actually address the problems, of the climate migrants and other vulnerable people in different primarily urban areas, but also, some local hotspots of, COVID-19. But it will address actually non-climatic disasters, including pandemic. So in any case, it might be in different other disasters as well. So under these two windows, our portfolio is about 22 million euro to support the climate migrants in primarily 5 urban locations, and those are Rajshahi City Corporation, Khulna City Corporation, Satkhira, Shirazganj, and Borishal. So it actually covers the coastal zone, 3 coastal districts, and 1 flood-prone district, and 1 drought and flood-prone districts. So we are covering actually these 3 different type of vulnerable ecosystems. But our target is mainly in 3 areas. We are trying to improve the social capacity of these vulnerable people, and economic capacity, economic opportunity, and also we are helping in a way so that they can avoid the risk of climate change that comes from the cyclone, storm surge, and waterlogging, flood inundation, unhygienic condition, heat wave, cold wave. These are the 3 areas that we are working to strengthen their resilience. So should I stop here? And if you have any other question, then I can go forward.
Just a follow-up question. And you work through NGOs primarily in the country? Is that how?
Yes. We actually support the NGOs, and NGOs could be INGO and also local NGOs. But we prioritize the local NGOs, the national NGOs. INGO can apply, but they have to have a partnership with local NGO. Otherwise, they cannot apply alone. So that's the mechanism.
Thank you so much. I think very exciting because, again, through this example, we see another modality, in this case, an endowment fund, where you basically invest the money and use the earnings from the money for funding adaptation measures at the local level. it's also quite unique because you're looking at some of the really emerging issues, in this case, climate-related migration, which is not very easily understood by many, and even more difficult to get mobilized money for those kind of work. That's extremely important. And lastly, of course, your modality is working through NGOs, which, as even Sophie was saying, ultimately at the end of the day, we need resources to come to different kind of partners, and these resources have to complement each other and work together. And we can discuss it later. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let me now move to Owen from Nordic Development Fund, which is of course a global fund working in developing countries and helping advance climate adaptation. So based on your experience, how are you supporting countries specifically on urban resilience related work and to help them leverage further resources from other climate funds if applicable? Over to you, Owen, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The Nordic Development Fund is a fund owned by the 5 Nordic countries, which are Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And we are the only climate finance instrument that is fully owned by these countries. And what we do is we actually we work mainly with co-financing with the MDBs, but also with other partners. So in this case, we're also working with the Asian Development Bank. But I would like to actually highlight something that we are doing with the African Development Bank. In Africa, what you see is you have a large number of countries across the continent, and the African Development Bank has been working in a very traditional manner with cities in the sense that they have been doing some transport in one city, water sanitation in another city, but they have not really looked at cities as a geographical area. So a couple of years ago, we, together with the bank, we established something called the Urban and Municipal Development Fund for Africa. And the idea with this fund is to take cities as an entity and work with the African Development Bank across all sectors in the bank, public and private, but also these traditional technical sectors, and look at the cities as a whole and prepare interventions. So this is a long-term initiative. We have a first 10-year phase, and in tandem with setting up this fund, the bank has also developed a first urban strategy. And because there are many firsts in this fund. So the fund is focused on very upstream urban planning, including climate change and resilience. We work with what you call rapid diagnostics. So we have, in the first phase, selected 5 cities from the 5 regions in Africa. Now we are going into 5 more cities. So in this sense, rapidly we are developing priorities for each individual cities and taking these priorities forward and financing through grant financing, actually making them investment ready. So this is one thing, but then there's a very big element of capacity building and knowledge. So many countries in Africa have not yet decentralized. So many cities are without their own means. They don't have. They depend on a national government for their own financing, and they don't have the instruments, for example, to undertake tax collection or manage their own budgets. They're totally dependent on the central governments. So there's a strong capacity building for governance and fiscal reforms in the fund, taking place at the same time, together with the identification of investment priorities, preparation of projects and investments. So this is a patient, long-term initiative where we are, through grant financing, trying to establish a platform for cities in Africa, allowing cities to actually really move on especially the climate agenda. But then again, how do you involve the poorest neighborhoods, communities in this process? I want to take one example from Latin America, together with the Inter-American Development Bank, where we had a long-term similar program as the one in Africa. We actually put in another grant for one specific capital city in Honduras, Tegucigalpa, to actually look at poor neighborhoods, because they were often overlooked in the municipal planning. They're not the ones that attract a lot of attention. So, and there's no this how do you say, there's no downscale information. And this makes it very difficult to compare how individual communities, households, and small businesses actually can adapt to severe weather events. This type of information is not available for city planners, not in the municipal administration. So we had for a couple of years something called the Asset Planning for Climate Change Adaptation Project, to show how bottom-up community asset adaptation planning can help address this gap of knowledge, and in doing so, actually kind of mainstreaming these priorities into city planning. So we had urban poor, together with municipal representatives, identify adaptation solutions to different challenges that they had in their communities, such as drought and flooding. And then we had funding for pilot testing of different solutions. And this was done using this participatory toolbox. So you had all, community members involved in this process. And this led to also a learning process inside the Inter-American Development Bank. And they are now deploying this in several urban programs in other countries in Latin America. So this is one way also of getting it from the bottom up into these financing institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your examples of working with the African Development Bank through this Municipal Development Fund, which I found very exciting, that the focus of the fund is not just the investment, but also the upstream work, the planning work, which allows you to identify the right kind of investments and then look at the reforms required in terms of improving fiscal capacity and public financial management capacity of city governments itself. And also, I think the work that you showcased through the IADB, Inter-American Development Bank, and I think I working from ADB, I clearly see the kind of catalytic role that NDF plays in organizations like ours, which are very big and often very difficult to maneuver, where a small amount of resources from you guys can really help us demonstrate a particular innovation, which then can be scaled up to our own operations and taken forward by our work. And this is of huge value to us. So thank you for sharing with us that. Let us move to Shouvik Ganguly from FCDO. Shouvik, you have been involved in the private sector work a lot in the context of resilience. What is your views on how can we help access private sector for adaptation work in urban areas, and specifically that benefits the poorest population? Over to you, Shouvik.
Right. So if we want to leverage private finance into climate adaptation, then we'll have to work through the project life cycle in terms of working with governments so that they are able to package projects, identify projects that are attractive for private investors, then ensuring that those projects get financing from institutional financiers, from private investors, and then monitoring those projects in terms of whether they are delivering those results. So basically FCDO, British government in India specifically, is providing support in all these stages. For example, we are working with the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, which is the PPP unit in India at the central level. We are trying to help them in embedding climate considerations in project preparation and project appraisal processes, specifically for public-private partnership projects through technical assistance. Then, basically, as I said, the second stage is helping government authorities, local bodies to package projects which are both address climate requirements as well as are attractive for private finance. So again, FCDO in India is supporting selected local governments in cities, major cities, to embed climate resilience and adaptation aspects in high-value projects. The third, now once the pipeline delivers projects that address climate requirements as well as are attractive to private investors, apologize for the background noise. My office has decided to test the fire alarm today. Basically, leveraging private investment, how this is being done is FCDO is playing the role of an anchor investor. So through a couple of equity funds, we are investing in private enterprises that are offering climate resilience, climate adaptation solutions to the market, either to the government or directly to users. And we being present gives a lot of comfort to other investors, be it other multilateral, bilateral agencies, or even institutional investors, commercial financiers. It just gives them a confidence that we've done our due diligence. We are supporting actively the recipients. And the focus largely has been on climate resilience and impact, but going ahead, we are increasing our focus on investing in climate adaptation, basically private enterprises that are offering climate adaptation solutions. There are other ways in which we are working to improve the ecosystem for infrastructure planning and execution. So one very interesting example is everybody knows that the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India is one of the largest social employment guarantee, social income guarantee scheme in the world. And this particular scheme basically guarantees 100 days of employment to rural households. And this employment was till now used to make roads, dig water reservoirs. What we are trying to do with the government of India is embedding climate adaptation aspects into the work that is being delivered through this guarantee scheme. So the first thing what we're doing with Government of India is linking the climate information with the geographical information. So once villages, peri-urban areas know which climate vulnerabilities they are exposed to, the effort is to link these projects, the roads, the water reservoirs, tanks being built under this guarantee scheme to climate adaptation. So that is another innovative way that we are helping. So this is basically overall what we are trying to do in different stages of the project development process. And I mean, this also covers the different financing sources for climate adaptation. Since we're working with the Government of India, they are putting in budgetary resources for climate adaptation through the more than £1 trillion national infrastructure pipelines. Some of those projects address climate adaptation needs. Second is working with cities so that they can raise local resources to fund that. And third is with private investors by ensuring, I'm really sorry about the noise, yeah, basically that. So our work covers all the stages as well as different sources. I'll stop now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shobik, so much for highlighting the importance of looking at the entire project life cycle, supporting local governments and packaging projects so that they are actually bankable and can be taken forward by the private sector. Also highlighting the role that FCDO or Government of UK plays as an anchor investor. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And lastly, but also sharing with us a Manrega example of how you're trying to ensure national government schemes are looking at more climate resilient infrastructure itself. So with that, I think we heard a range of examples over here. Let me move on to the next question, which is common to all of you. But meanwhile, I would highly encourage all participants to please post your questions, which we will soon be able to answer. My next question is, while all of you talked about different examples, you actually highlighted some of the enabling environment which is important if we want finance to flow and benefit the poorest population. You talked about policies, about institutions, about knowledge, about partnerships, about organized communities. So maybe I'll go back to each one of you, and if you can just pick one of the enabling environment which you think is most important and explain how that can be strengthened if we really want to scale up adaptation finance. So maybe I'm going to go in reverse order. Shobik, do you want to start from you? Any one enabling environment factor which you think is critical and can be improved?
So the first element, the most important element, is in terms of capacity within different levels of government, specifically in terms of the local government, because I believe local government, with their direct relationship to urban infrastructure, are in the frontline position to embed climate adaptation. And there are so many innovative ways in which resources can be raised, which expands the possibilities in what we can do in urban infrastructure. Just giving an example of India, Indian municipalities are highly dependent on budgetary allocations from central and state government, and they are very restricted in terms of raising local resources. But there are examples, from Indonesia, where there was this proposal to use value capture finance mechanism to fund climate adaptation in terms of dikes to protect Jakarta from coastal floods. So, but that can only be done by the municipality at its own level in terms of, monetizing its properties, which are now protected from floods, by commercial development, and using that money to fund a part of the dike. These kind of resources can only be raised when the city has the capacity to understand these options, to implement these options. So I think from a capacity perspective, there's a lot of attention being paid to central governments, there's policies and all that. But on ground capacity, in terms of human capacity in municipalities to identify these options, to design instruments based on these, that is, I think, a most critical factor in terms of climate adaptation.
Thank you, Shobik, for highlighting the importance of building capacity of local government, but also give an example of how land value captures and other market mechanisms can help in financing adaptation. Of course, my follow-up question would have been then, how do we make sure that land value capture is actually helping investments that benefits the poorest population? I mean, that becomes that equation is quite tough to look at, and the economics may not work sometimes. Let us go to Owen. From your side, you're looking at a global level. What do you think is the key enabling environment that needs to be improved if you want to really build resilience of the poor and for finances to flow?
Yes, certainly. I believe very much in partnerships and knowledge. Many of the solutions are out there. So actually making solutions available and known by cities can be a very strong way forward. So in our support, we try to also involve city networks or building city networks. In the case of Africa, actually establishing a city network. That was the same for Latin America. These emerging and sustainable cities, they started out with 5 pilot cities. Now they have more than 200 fast-growing cities in Latin America integrated into one city network, where they have a lot of knowledge and exchange events. We actually had 17 cities visit Copenhagen and Malmö and look at different city solutions. We did that 2 years ago. We are planning another one, if the pandemic allows us, for next year for African cities. And there we will piggyback on the ICLEI World Congress in Malmö to actually have a delegation of city representatives from Africa come and look at relevant city solutions in Copenhagen, Malmö, but also Oslo. Oslo is a world leader on e-mobility, for example, which again is of high interest for many cities. But again, you mentioned land value capture. In the case of Copenhagen, Copenhagen was almost bankrupt 30 years ago. They have used old depleted industrial areas to really lift and provide new housing and new development areas. But there you can put in criteria. So you say that at least 20-30% of all new should be social housing or accessible type of housing, which they have done. So you have kind of a much more mixed population. So it's not only the very rich taking over, as you can see in the Docklands in London and so on. But there are many ideas out there, many good solutions. So having these living labs is within city networks is really something we should strive for. And there again, the very inclusive type of development you've seen in Nordic countries is a model that is of very much interest for African cities and also Latin American cities. We can see that from the feedback we have received. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the importance of partnerships and knowledge and actually learning from each other, whether it's South-South or North-South, the other way around. And also explaining that there could be conditionalities introduced in new mechanisms such as land value capture to make sure a certain percentage of actually benefits the poorest population. That's very useful. I have received some questions, but please feel free to provide more questions. This is a request of participants. Let's move on to Mr. Rabani from BRAC. From your point of view, what is one of the enabling environment that's important to help scale up financing for the urban poor?
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. This is an excellent question I would consider. And at first I would agree with the former colleague Shovik and my other colleague who talked about capacity, knowledge, and partnership. But for me, I would choose the policy instrument. Let me tell you the reason. You see, in the Glasgow Pact, under the adaptation section, one of the clause was integration of adaptation in local planning, subnational planning. And if you come back to Bangladesh, we do have national planning and national instrument on climate change, Bangladesh climate change strategy and action plan. But unfortunately, we have a very strong criteria. When NGO submits the detailed proposal, they have to consult with the local authority, and at the same time, they have to align with the local policy instrument. But that is missing. They align with the national policy, but there is no local policy that address the climate change issue. They do have a master plan, but climate change adaptation is missing in the master plan. So without having this local policy instrument that really recognize the climate problems in the city corporation area, is very difficult to support them. So this is one of the enabling environment that the local authority has to ensure that so that the proposals can be aligned with the local policy and can be supported with the adaptation finance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of local policy instruments and also answering one of the questions which came in the chat box. And I think it's very critical about how we align financing around planning processes. And this, of course, requires policies to be in place. Sophie, from your perspective, one key enabling environment that can be improved.
Thank you, Arya. I would choose or focus on institutions. What the colleague from BRAC just said is very true. And to make those linkages intentional between, nationally determined contribution, national adaptation plans, and then the local planning, you need institutions to carry that message within government at various levels and across sectors. So that is one reason why I would pick that. Also, as we work with local government authorities, you also ask what they need. A colleague from NDF also mentioned the issue of climate information. They need localized climate information so that they can do that integration, which indeed the COP is urging countries to work on, integration of local adaptation to local planning, amongst others. And the reason also the institutions are very important, I think, also both at central level and local level. So when it comes to central level, actually also local level, strong institutions can also help federate partnerships. And more often than not, it's actually quite difficult for government, who might be the entry point for a lot of the funding that is passing through, to kindly guide their partners to, federate efforts towards certain approaches, or to really achieve true complementarities, or to invite them to not start a new project that is separate for their own system, but rather use their own system. And the same could apply to a market systems approach. So I think institutions can actually federate the other enabling or support further other enabling environment. And most likely also at the local level, strong local institutions can also federate efforts. And we discussed the issue of private sector, also local communities, CBOs. When it comes to local governments in particular, they have a mandate for many climate sensitive sectors, but also a convening power possibly for these various local actors to work together and to also utilize certain forms of finance, such as grant finance, to move towards PPPs with private actors, amongst others. So that's what I would like to add, and focus on institutions to also link to other enabling factors. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie, for highlighting institutions and how important role they can play in bringing coherence among different partners and what they are financing. Ibu Amy, from your perspective, one key enabling environment which is important.
Yeah, I really agree to what Sophie said. Yeah, in the local level, there are many community-based group work forms, but the important is not about the quantity, but how these existing groups, community group, have the strength and capacity to first be aware of their surrounding, and also participate, actively involved as well in the discussions to the issues that affects them as the community, including through the local development and planning process, and also monitor the progress. However, only a few local actors can be involved in the process, especially among the urban poor or the women as well, and make the meaningful contributions that address their vulnerability in the area, one of which is due to the gender capacity gap. But like in Indonesia, there is a women group established by the government. We call it PKK, but their role is more to health sectors, while women have an important role in the building community resilience, not only limited to the health sectors. So introducing and involving them in the risk mapping, and then training, support, like providing flexible funding for demonstrating the resilience initiative, peer learning, dialogue with stakeholders, it will deepen their understanding of climate actions, and also it will boost the confidence, the leadership as well, and organization skill, so they can be more eligible, accountable, and also recognized as the leaders that representing the community, and also able to influence the development planning process. So I will say that the organizing the community is essential, as they are the front line and also driver for change in their own community.
Thank you so much, Ibu Amy, for highlighting the importance of organized communities and how they can interact with local governments and really negotiate what they want in terms of building resilience. There's one question in the chat box looking at, maybe Shobik, you can try to respond, is the possibilities of municipal bonds for financing resilience in South and Southeast Asia region. Any idea from your side, Shobik?
Yeah, so municipal bonds, I mean, they've been often talked about over the years about as a source of financial resources. The challenge with climate adaptation projects is not many projects have a sustainable revenue model. So, and in the absence of a revenue model, it's complicated to structure projects that will be able to pay market-based instruments. But it's not to say that it's impossible, but it has to then, then you'll have to combine some concessional or patient capital along with the debt that you're raising from through municipal bonds, and also maybe provide credit enhancement so that the cost of finance from municipal bonds come down, and secondly, again, you'll have to cherry pick projects that have a sustainable revenue model, even though they might, it will not cover all sorts of projects. You'll have to cherry pick projects that have some possibility of revenue generation. But then, as I said, you'll have to mix it with patient capital, credit enhancement, package it so much so that institutional investors are likely to subscribe to that. So it's complicated.
Thank you, Shobik, so much. So maybe I'm going to go back and ask each one of you just one last takeaway point from this discussion. What do you take away? So maybe we can go back to start with Ibu. Amy, do you want to start?
I would say that, organizing a community, including the women group, and build their capacity to do the risk mapping from the women perspective, so they can be more confident and develop the priority plans using the formal mechanism already exists in the local level. And to do that, the women group is to be informed of how the planning and budgeting system, and even involved in the committee to formulate the planning itself, not only as the participants. And lastly, Village Fund can be used for the empowerment. However, the recognition of the women group is still low. So providing flexible funding to the women group to demonstrate the resilient practices, it can be one of the ways to them to increase the contributions in building community resilience and also build on recognitions of the wider community.
Thank you, Ibu. Sophie, one takeaway point from your side.
Thank you. I would say one takeaway would be to try to work across a range of constituencies and partners, because we heard many good examples here, but how can we somehow deploy these various approaches, possibly simultaneously in the same locations to achieve, increased impacts, various types of local actors, various types of, central level institutions, both public and private. So, and also possibly therefore use project modalities as a way to strengthen country systems and market systems so that we can indeed go to scale. And for that, using financing mechanisms that have that potential, and there are quite a few out there. If we can federate efforts behind them, thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Mr. Rabbani, from your side, one takeaway point, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for an effective adaptation solution, you need to engage the communities, local authorities, and of course, this should be aligned with the local policy instruments to have a long-term impact at the community level in the urban areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Owen, from your side, one last takeaway point.
Yeah, certainly we should really support as much as possible the opportunities for learning and knowledge. This is because cities will have to eventually figure out themselves how to become climate resilient. They cannot wait for investors outside or MDBs to come and provide everything. They need to learn from each other. That's really a key message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shobik.
Yeah, Argo, basically, again, engaging with the community in terms of working with the community to identify the vulnerabilities and to embed the community in the planning process at the local levels. That is the most important key takeaway from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just to wrap up from my side, I found it very exciting discussion. Of course, we started with the idea that we need more money for adaptation resilience at the local level, specifically for the poorest people living in urban areas. But I think the discussions clearly highlighted that it's just not about a quantum of money. It's actually much more improvement to the wider ecosystem. So we heard about 5 key things from me at least. One is the sources of money can be quite diverse, starting from the state budget example village fund in Indonesia to an endowment fund in case of BRACs, or in terms of grant mechanisms given by NDF. We heard about municipal development funding mechanisms. We heard about municipal bonds. And now these are different funding sources, which of course has to be aligned with each other and see how they can complement each other, because they are not, everything cannot, it's not meant for every purpose. That's the first point. Second point we heard about is just not about the money, but about improving the system through the right kind of reforms, the right kind of capacity building of local governments, so they are better aware of risk, better able to package projects, looking at different kind of incentive mechanisms like the performance-based allocation of local, looking at building awareness among communities themselves so they are able to understand risk, but also negotiate what they want with the local government. So that portion is equally important if you want the money to be flowing to at the local level. Third, we heard about what does the money then support? One thing is, of course, we heard about resilient infrastructure or nature-based solutions. We also heard about improving planning processes, improving empowerment of communities. These are also equally important if we really want resilience building to take place in a sustainable manner. Fourth aspect, we heard about the modalities. Of course, we have the loans and the grants, but these can go to various kind of constituencies. You can work with governments, national government, local governments, but also we need complementary systems to work with NGOs or directly with the community grassroots organization itself. And lastly, I also heard about a very important role that different organizations are playing, whether it's the more catalytic role played by NDF, or as we heard from Shobik about the anchor investor role by UK government, or even as Sophie's talked about how the local program can really help provide early startup kind of mechanisms, which eventually then let's get embedded in government systems and able to leverage other resources from different partners. So for me, that was a very, very rich discussion. Of course, it's not an end to it. There's a lot of work to happen if we really want money to flow for adaptation resilience purposes in urban areas that directly benefits the urban poor. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for this discussion, and very warm thanks for all of us, and have a good day ahead. Thank you.